cast it into darkness, or wind up being on one end or somewhere on that continuum, but you'll always influence people, always. And the more aware that you and I become of the power of our influence, the more we have a say in the outcome. So it really requires people desiring to be more mindful, to live a life that's more mindful. By mindful, let me define that. By mindful, I'm talking about the word being aware, being awake. When I walk into a room, if I'm not aware and awake of the power of my influence, I could really do some damage. And that's not why I'm there. I'm there to serve them in the best possible way I can. If I'm not aware of the power of my influence with my family, and like you, I have 4 kids, 3 boys and a girl. I don't know how you deal with 4 girls. I mean, that's like, oh, wow.
You get used to it, yeah.
I guess you do. I have boys down. When the girl came along, she was last. I said, oh, wow, I have to go to school again. Yeah, but anyway, but the power of my influence is not neutral. The power of my kids' influence over me is not neutral. So it requires us to be mindful, be aware and awake. So when we are aware of that and we go out on the court and we're playing lacrosse or we're playing basketball or whatever the sport is we happen to be playing, you have to be aware that everything you do, even if you're not on the court and you're sitting on the bench, if your head's down and your body is closed up, you're sending a message. Your influence is very, very negative on the rest of the team. So it's an important topic for me because leadership is really about making that connection. And we can't make that connection unless we're aware of the power of our influence. And then we can talk about, what we need to do to make that happen. And how do we demonstrate that? Because it really is, it's nice that we're talking about these things, but, ultimately what we all have to do is we have to implement them. And while we know a lot, can we feel a lot? Can we feel our influence? Can we feel the power of that influence and try to make that work for us and not against us, and to help other people in the process?
Yeah, and I think that's part of some of the things you've said, and I've heard this over and over, and I've used it a lot, which is you're writing your own story. You're figuring out your story. It's not predetermined. It can't be assigned to you. Let's get into that a little bit about what people say. Something like writing your own ticket. Again, they start thinking of the material things versus your story is far deeper than that. It is that awareness. And I want to pause here and let, for those of us, the listeners that aren't aware of a lot of where your thoughts come from, you combine Eastern thought, Native American traditions, Christianity, Western psychology, things like that. It's a blend. You've got Taoism that's in there. So the story, that's a deep spiritual thing. Let's talk about how you get, I guess, people to buy into that, and not as some touchy-feely kind of thing that, hey, I got to go hit the weight room. I don't have time for the story stuff.
Yeah. Well, back in the day, and by the day, I'm going to put a number on it. I'm going to say, let's see, Thinking Body, Dancing Mind. It's still one of my bestsellers. That came out in 1992. So definitely before then. So that's 25 years ago. I think people would have probably had me certified crazy, I mean, publishers told me. I mean, before that book was published, I was lucky. I hit a publisher at the right time. Bantam Books was craving something like this, and I just happened to hit them at the right time. But that book was refused for publication by 15 other publishing houses before that. Mm-hmm. And, what's interesting is I almost gave up on it. And if I did, I wouldn't be talking with you today.
What told you to keep going?
My wife, Jan. She had some wisdom that I didn't. She said to me one day, she made a comment after about 5 refusals. I said, you know what? No one wants this. It's too early, and I don't want to lose track with your question because it's about the spirituality and how do people buy into that and how do I get that to happen. She said, look, what are you writing that book about? That's all she had to say. And in that book, there's a chapter that's on tenacity and fearlessness and those kind of spiritual concepts. And she said, if you give up on that, aren't you sort of contradicting what you're trying to teach people? And she was absolutely right. So that kept me going.
Which is part of your story. Yeah.
Huh?
Which is part of your story.
It's a big part of my story, Dave. Again, without that book, I wouldn't be where I am today. And I can connect all the dots and see it came from that book. Okay, so that said, it's a good lesson in perseverance, huh?
Yeah.
Yeah, just when I was about to quit, for the second time, this publisher Bantam came along and they loved it, and the rest is history. So that's back in 1992, but as we went forward, and I started going out there with athletes and coaches and teams and giving talks and conventions and conferences and stuff like that, I realized that the spirituality of sport is not just something I think is nice to have, but it was actually something that people craved. And it wasn't so much craving spirituality in sport. It was just a deeper, more important, meaningful connection with themselves and their family and life in general. And sport was just a vehicle.
Right.
So I was using sport as a vehicle to transport people to where they really craved, what they really craved, and how they wanted to be. We're all spiritual beings having a life experience. And when you speak the language of courage and patience and perseverance and tenacity and fearlessness, integrity, sacrifice, trust, and respect, when you hear those words, who doesn't want to be a part of that? And so I knew I was onto something. It was just a matter of how many doors would open, when they would open, but I had to stay true to my course. I had to follow my North Star, which kept telling me, this is very valuable. Now, the second part of that is I didn't wave a flag, I'm a Taoist, or carry a Buddhist flag someplace and try to sell that. Because people weren't craving Taoist thought. They were craving spiritual thought. Now let me explain that. In the Tao Te Ching, it's 2,000 plus years old, one of the sacred books of the philosophy of Tao. In that book, in one of the chapters, one of the verses, it says this: we lose, yet in this way win. Wow. It's like we lose, yet even though we lose, we're really winning. Boy, oh boy, oh boy. How many people could really, really grab onto that, right? Because what I'm doing is I'm saying to them, look, you lost a game yesterday. I know that. But why are we a better team today because of that loss? How did we win ultimately? The game was lost on the scoreboard, but you learned this and this and this and this. And I got to teach them that, our mistakes and errors and setbacks and failures, these are all our greatest teachers. In fact, everyone that's listening to us today would admit that the greatest things that they've ever learned in life came from their setbacks and mistakes and errors and failures. They're our greatest teachers. So guess what? This is a very strong Taoist way of thinking. This is something that's Eastern in its genesis many, many years before we existed. But it still is true today. And then the other thought of our opponent is not someone we need to annihilate or crush. Our opponent is our greatest partner who helps us to get to levels we would never be if we weren't competing against them. When I trace the definition, when I trace the origin of the word compete, I take it back to the Latin root. And the Latin root is compatire. And compatire, interestingly enough, Dave, means to seek together. So, indeed, you are my partner in a basketball game. And because you're bringing your game, your A game, it's going to put me in a place where I'm going to be forced to play my best in order to compete with you. So we're seeking together our individual and collective greatness. That's all Eastern thought. And of course, all of these wonderful virtues or values like courage and tenacity and patience and respect and integrity, these are all written out in the philosophy of the Native American tradition.
Well, and that's lacrosse is. As I got into that, we used to teach the kids in the elementary schools when I lived in Atlanta about lacrosse, and we'd read a book, and it was about the day the animals played, and it was a Native American book, and they played to settle scores as opposed to war. They did it to celebrate. They did it for being thankful, but it was a very spiritual thing.
Lacrosse is, lacrosse is an amazing spiritual history. Even the word itself, lacrosse, means the cross.
Right.
And back way back when it was a Native American sport, played up in Canada and then into the upper northeastern part of the United States. That's where it all began. At night they would look up at the sky and they would watch what goes on in the universe and translate that into the game. When it was thunder, or lightning, it was all tied into the game of lacrosse. And, so spirituality, as I define it, is not a religion. Just like Taoist and Buddhist thought is not a religion, or Native American traditions not a religion as such. Religion is different. But this is a philosophy, a way of being. And spirituality of sport is the deep core values that when we learn these values and we learn these wonderful traditions, we not only become better at the sport that we're playing, but we become better people too. And that's why I see sport as a wonderful teacher for the bigger game of life. And all of my books, no matter which book I write, I always bring in the analogy of how that sport is related to life and use the same anecdotes and the same stories for both sports and life. And so spirituality in sport is amazing. So I tell these athletes and the coaches, there are 3 talents. There's the physical talent, which obviously you all have, and everybody you play will have physical talent. There's mental talent, and about 60% of the people you play will have mental talent. They'll have someone like me coming in, training their minds. And then there's spiritual talent. Yes, spirituality is a talent. It's learned, it's a skill, it's developed. And only about 1% of the teams you play will have spiritual talent. So all those championship teams that you mentioned in the beginning, I've had, counting conference championships, Final Four championships, like 109 or 110 championship teams at the collegiate and professional level. They all had spiritual talent. And I was there to help to serve them, to help them see that you can develop fearlessness. You can become fearless. You can develop courage. Not everybody has courage, and if you want it, you can have it. And so